Hi, welcome back to AP Human Geography with Kristen Brandt. Want to thank you all for joining us again today. Hopefully, you can take a moment and talk to your folks. Today is Census Day. I sent my students a remind. I was pretty excited when I got my census form to fill out. So if you get an opportunity, please talk to them, and it actually will connect to our lesson today. So I'm going to go ahead and transfer us over to our screen here. And here we go. Okay. You would think I'd be better at this by now. So reminder again, Kristen Brandt. I am from Glenbard West High School. I'm in Glen Ellen, Illinois. I want to thank a few of you that reached out. I know that we had a student in Goochland, Virginia, that tuned in yesterday. And so kind of fun that we're catching people not only here in the United States, but across the globe. And so without further ado, let's recap what we did yesterday. So yesterday we were really talking about our cities, and we were talking about some challenges and that idea of sustainability as well. Here's what I like about these FRQ practice questions. I honestly think that there's enough overlap that some of these ideas could still work their way into FRQs that you may do for us in May. So describe one social challenge for cities in less developed countries. Big things that we really talked about was having adequate housing, and permanent housing. Remember, we looked at, and I know that Miss Lindsley last or on Tuesday talked about squatter settlements, making that your own, but also sanitation is a huge problem. That's a social challenge within less developed countries. And so then talking about why having adequate sanitation is a necessary function for a city to actually evolve would be important in here. Describing one environmental challenge for cities in more developed countries. I think the big thing here is really talking about pollution. um, think about our energy use, think about how our commitment to trying to change that. But for the meantime, we are the leading consumers of fossil fuels and what that does to the environment. But also that transitions into our energy use and how we are the leading consumers of energy. And so the problems and the burdens that that places on cities. Explain how supranational organizations such as the UN can support urban sustainability. So you're going to hear me continue to talk about these sustainability goals that come out of the UN, but more importantly, with supranational organizations, you could even talk about it's that working together as a collective. So the Paris Agreement, talking about even the EU joining forces and talking and working together. It's great if one country is going to take on sustainability, urban sustainability, or even one city. The problem is that it's bigger than that. And so when we talk about scale, it's important that we work together in order to truly bring about change. And then the other one, discuss how urban growth creates similar challenges in both more developed and less developed countries. And really what we're talking about here is that the housing type of housing problems might be different. For example, we might be talking about rent issues, or we might be talking about adequate housing. But at the end of the day, we're talking about housing. Transportation issues might be different. We're going to talk about congestion in even though we have access to adequate transportation versus not having the infrastructure, transportation issues in LDCs. But the biggest one that I would also, sorry, talk about is water. We know that access to clean water in LDCs is a problem. Continued access to water in some of the places in the United States that are growing is a problem. And then I would also argue farmland. Farmland, our cropland, is a huge concern across the globe as urban sprawl continues to happen. That rural to urban movement continues. That we know that that puts pressure on our farmland. We also know with climate change and with rising sea levels that that's also going to put pressure on that farmland. And ultimately, we need to be able to feed our people, and we need clean water in order for society to continue down the path that we've been moving. So what are we going to look at today? I'm not going to lie. Today is one of my favorites, and I'm super excited. My students, the moment that they see this, my students are going to go, oh my God, they're going to roll their eyes and say, oh, of course, Mrs. Brandt, because we're going to talk about measures of development. So we are going to describe social and economic measures. We're going to do a ton of data analysis today, and hopefully we'll dance around a little bit of the limitations of that data as well. See, I told you filling out the census is important. So here's also why I'm most excited is that today's lesson truly connects back to that population lesson. And population ideas that your teacher, I'm sure, has spent time with you on when we talk about distribution of population. And so we talk about the consequences of that and we talk about those dynamics. Ultimately, we have to be talking about those indicators. And so you've probably been exposed to a lot of these indicators. So see this as a review then. Hopefully we can add a little bit of new information, but ultimately you have to be able to take this data and categorize it and draw some conclusions. I think you're going to be able to do that and you're going to find some of this as entertaining as possible. So here we go. So guided practice. Ultimately, what I tell my students is that I want them to be able to look at a set of numbers and they're able to tell me if this country is a developed country or a developing country. I want them to be able to then tell me also what indicator helped them make that decision. And so when you're looking at these, notice I did not fill in the MDC, LDC column yet. What is helping you make that decision? Is it life expectancy? Is it schooling? GNI, infant mortality rate, total fertility rate, percent urban? These are things that should give you some idea of not only if it's developed or developing, but where it is in that continuum. And so I would ask you, I think I've stalled enough. Could you tell me which two are MDCs? Could you tell me which two are LDCs? So I'm hoping you were able to pick out that the top and the bottom were MDCs. I actually gave them, so we have Norway and Switzerland here. Again, no teacher is going to ask you to memorize these numbers, but we need you to be able to categorize the numbers. I mean, I would like to think that you said, holy buckets, I don't know what GNI is, but I know that 68 and 59 are big time different than in the thousands. I also take a look at total fertility rate. I mean, we're under 2 kids versus over 3. Those should be some indicators. And so we're going to dive a little bit more into those as we move on here, which means, ta-da, hopefully you're able to put the middle two. We're looking at Liberia, western coast of Africa, and Yemen, taking a look at that Arabian Peninsula. And so looking at, I mean, look at the years of schooling. That should be an indicator, right? Like it's going to be difficult for us to progress if we're not receiving adequate education. Now, I put on there percent urban. It's not one we're going to talk about much today, but as a link back to our last unit, but also a link to the demographic transition model. So take a look at the percent urban for both Liberia and Yemen. I mean, we're under 55% for both of them, which tells us the majority of their population is engaged in agriculture. So that is something that is going to show up or could show up, sorry, on your AP exam. I have no secrets, sorry. I really am just guessing. But when we're talking about urbanization, being able to move into those cities gives us better access to resources. When we see those low numbers of people living in cities, it means, first of all, that wave has not hit yet, and that they have a long ways to go as far as moving on that demographic transition model. So let's dive into this data and let's see where we're going. Okay, so we're going to start with some economic data. Now, both my boys are in AP Macro. Actually, they're in Micro now. They took Macro first semester. So they're going to go a little more in depth with the development measurements. So those of you, if you're like my students, you're going to try and copy down every single word that's on the screen. You're going to be here all day. And we're never going to assess you on the nuances between these terms for the next, well, really for this assessment. If you take AP Macro, and I hope you do, you're going to then have to know a little more of these nuances in between there. So for example, When we talk about gross domestic product, GDP, so the total value of all goods and services within a country in a given year, we're talking money, okay? So how much money does a country make? And so everything produced within that country. Gross national product, and that should say product, is the value of all goods and services produced in a country's economy in a given year, but all goods and services by corporations, individuals, whether or not they're located in that country. So let's say I have a business and it's located outside of the United States, but I am a US citizen. That money, even though it's outside the United States, gets calculated in the GNP. What we're going to use today is we're going to talk mostly about gross national income, so GNI, and then we'll talk about per capita in just a second. But this is the including what's produced within a country and then income also received from investments. Again, if your biggest thing that we're talking about here is we're talking money, perfect. When you see per capita, we can throw per capita behind any of these. It's divided by its population. So honestly, we're just trying to break it down so we're not talking millions and trillions and billions of dollars. Like what's kind of that, if an individual citizen, what would their kind of the income be at this point? So but it's really what would their share be? So now if you go back to those numbers that we used earlier, so we were looking at 60, 59,000 versus 1,000. Now that should go, oh my goodness, that is not a lot of money. The other thing we have to take into account are a couple of things here. And this I think is important because this we see in agriculture, we see it in our political units, that idea of formal versus informal. When we talk about formal economy here, we're talking about our economy that is taxed, it's monitored by the government, it is going to be included in our gross national product. Okay, so this is going to be everything kind of combined together. It is, if you fill it, hopefully you know that our taxes have been deferred. We don't have to have them by that April 15th right now, but things that you would claim on your taxes. Unlike your informal economy, okay, that's neither taxed nor monitored by a government. It is not included in the government's gross national product. So the reason we talk about this too, especially outside the United States, and we're going to talk more about this on Friday, that informal economy really drives a lot of countries and a lot of people for their success. My guess is, though, some of you participate in our informal economy. Do we have any babysitters out there? Do we have anybody that's mowing their neighbor's lawns and getting paid? My guess is that some of us, we do participate in these things and we don't get taxed on them. And so that is not necessarily factoring into when we're talking our gross national product. So we're going to talk more about that on Friday because we're going to take a look at gender and where we see a lot of women kind of ending up in those areas. So, we like maps. Here we go. So when we take a look at this map here, the source here is from the World Bank. Look at these numbers and look at the countries that are above the 42,000 mark. Canada, US. When I say Northern Europe rocks, wait till you see all the statistics by the end of today. Western Europe, Australia, Japan. Did anybody pause on Saudi Arabia and go, what's going on there? And then you should go, what resource do they have? What supranational organization are they a major player with? Who do they trade with? The United States. But out of all seriousness, those are things you should pause and go, okay, I'm seeing some trends here. Then I look at, really looking below 2000. I mean, look at Central Africa, look at the Horn of Africa. Can you see Afghanistan? Some of these countries in the Caribbean? I mean, think how difficult it is. Think how difficult, how do you compete if you don't have the money? And that's kind of what we want to start talking about later today is why this is so important is if I don't make enough money as a country, how can I invest it back into the people? How can I improve some of these other indicators if we don't have the money? So what we're going to do is in just a second, we're going to test some of our knowledge. But before we go further, I do want to also point out is that even in those areas that we're saying have enough money, such as North America, Western and Northern Europe, Australia, not all of them is that income distributed equally. Look at how unequal the United States is. Again, Northern Europe rocks, least unequal. That pretty much that what they're saying is that their income is distributed pretty equally throughout their population. So we still have a long ways to go even in the United States. So we talk about the haves versus have-nots. I mean, even think about it. We talked about it here. You know, part of your ability to tune in is pretty fantastic. But what about classmates around the country that don't have access to this, that are not one-to-one schools? And so those are things that we still need to tackle even here in an MDC. So nobody's going to ask you to memorize the statistics in this class. What we are going to ask you to be able to do is categorize. So my question is, do you believe these countries would have a high or low GNI? Okay, so we're going to practice, take a look at these countries. I've picked 10. I'll give you a hint, 5 and 5. If you identified these 5 countries as countries that would have a high GNI, woo, nice job. But out of all seriousness, what we're trying to do is kind of start to categorize. And so I tried to pick countries that obviously we've got some in Europe, but even Eastern Europe. And hopefully you know that Austria and Poland would lag behind France and Belgium as in their GNI and some of their levels of development, but they're still going to be much higher than the countries that I've listed here. And so notice we are going to, I feel that when we talk, I just hate saying it, is that I feel like we constantly are looking at countries in Africa that are struggling. And so much of that goes back to those superimposed boundaries, those imperialism conquests. And so when we review that, we'll come back to that. But at the same time, we still have issues in other areas too. Think about Haiti and think about the environmental challenges that they've had recently. Think about Pakistan. I think about as, kind of this buffer sometimes between India and Afghanistan, our home bases, we're moving people in and out of there. They've dealt with some environmental issues, the flooding of the Indus River. We know that we're going to talk on Friday some gender equity issues in that country as well, that it makes it really difficult. How do we move forward? So we've been talking about money. We're going to move into some other data. We're going to look at some social data, and we're going to look at some demographic data as well. And what we want to see is how do those connect to those finances? So fertility rates, one of the things that I was trying to do is keep coming back to other indicators for development. And so number of children per woman, and this is looking at some estimates. So the darker the color, you can see here that, we're talking over 3.5 children per childbearing age. And the challenges that places on a country. And so I know during the population unit, you talked with your teachers about why people might have more children. It used to be having more children because you didn't know how many were going to live. And so we talked about inheritance issues. It could be that you're an agrarian society. And so we have more children so that we can help them work the land with us. Less children, it's, I will speak from myself that my career was important. And so it delayed me having children. And so then I typically am not going to have as many children. And so all of that, when we start talking total fertility rates, it's indicators of levels of development for us. Even in the United States, we see some discrepancies too. We see some states that are going to have higher fertility rates than others. Find your state. Where does it rank? When we take a look, we see the higher ones typically are going to be in states that are more agrarian focused. We take a look at if we look at California and New York, they're going to be lower. They tend to be more urban. They tend to be more densely populated. And so the pressures of having children tend to be a little bit less. You're not going to typically have as many kids. Okay, so let's talk about total fertility rates. Take a look at this list of countries. Can you identify which ones are going to have the higher total fertility rates? So remember, we were talking some health reasons why people have more. We are talking about some agricultural reasons why people are having more kids. We could throw in some religious reasons as well. And so in the culture unit, we're going to dive into that a little bit more, but let's maybe for right now just focus on those big ideas because it gets a little nuanced when we start going down the religion path. I apologize. So hopefully, if you identified these countries here as countries that would have high total fertility rates. Okay, you'll notice again, 3 in Africa. We've got Iraq in Southwest Asia, and then the Philippines in Southeast Asia. And so when you're looking at those, you start going, okay, so farming, um, definitely could see that, definitely could see access to healthcare. And so it's drawing those conclusions. Hopefully then, ta-da, you were able to place these other countries as countries that are going to have low total fertility rates. And we'll talk a little bit more about Northern Europe coming up. But you'll notice we've got Eastern Europe, Western Europe, South Korea, so East Asia, and then obviously North America as well. And so notice these are total fertility rates below 2, and we are here, these are total fertility rates above 3. Okay, so what else do we need to know? This one I find fascinating. Not going to lie, infant mortality rates. So the number of babies that die within the first year of their lives in a given population. Okay, you're probably thinking I'm a little morbid. I'm not trying to be morbid. Why I find this one so interesting is this actually tells us so much more about a country than just the number of babies that live past their first year. And what I mean by that is that infant mortality is really also an indicator of gender equity. And here's why. How do a lot of babies, actually, let me rephrase that question. Why don't a lot of babies in some of these countries that are dark red make it past that first year? And I'm going to argue part is gender equity. First of all, prenatal care. Okay, so that idea of what we're going to find in places that have lower infant mortality, take a look at Canada, take a look at Northern Europe, Western Europe, Australia. Those areas are really focused on prenatal care. And so getting women into the doctor prior to giving birth, making sure they're taking the right vitamins, a balanced diet, that their home life is good, trying to really make sure that the body is prepping itself for that. Once the baby is born, gender equity again. Think about caloric intake. In a lot of these areas that are red, we're going to say that breastfeeding is the common form of nutrition for those children. If the mom is not getting enough calories, the baby's not getting enough calories. And so what we're really taking a look at then is who's getting the food. And so it could just be as simple as they're struggling to put food on the table anyway. But oftentimes, if I look at places such as Afghanistan, Central Africa, Pakistan, those tend to be patriarchal societies. And what we see is that the men or the boys are going to get fed first, and the women are going to get fed second. Not all, remember we talk about limitations in scale, but this tends to be the pattern. And so if the female's not getting enough calories, then the baby's not getting enough calories. And so this is why when I said this one's fascinating is because this actually tells us more than just if babies are making it or not. It's giving us an insight into it. Could be patriarchal versus matriarchal society. It could be caloric intake. It also gives us insight into hospital and healthcare as well. In the United States, we're still pretty low, but take a look at kind of our southern region that struggles a little bit more than I take a look at a California, Washington State, Idaho, those, or New York. Um, is there something about diet? Is there something about male-female roles? You'd have to do more research. But remember, even then, our numbers are still much better than when we look at the rest of, when we look at these deep red countries. Okay, so let's see how we do. Take a look at the countries that I have listed up here. Do you believe that these countries would have a high or low infant mortality rate? If you said these countries have a high infant mortality rate, you are correct. So Afghanistan, okay? I mean, I highlighted Pakistan, Chad and Nigeria in Africa, Indonesia, India. There was a great video that my students watched called World in Balance. And this video really talked about that need for having multiple children and having boys and the pressure that that patriarchal society places on a society. And so there's just that constant struggle of how do we provide. Then we take a look at, obviously, these would be our countries that would have a low infant mortality. Again, you should see a trend here. Greece, we're going to throw in Southern Europe, Denmark, Northern Europe with Finland again, and then let's throw in our Oceania, New Zealand. My students are always crabby. I don't spend enough time talking about Australia and New Zealand. How about your teachers? And then let's throw in Israel um, as well. And so this, I mean, look at that. We're talking 7 per 1,000 versus 20. I mean, that is significant. And so what it really lets us now, remember, we're talking about gender and we're talking about healthcare. Okay, literacy. And so when we start talking, on Friday, we're going to talk more about literacy as well. But here, what we're going to look at is kind of literacy rate of people, total people ages 15 and above. And so obviously here, the darker red, we're talking 96% or above have that, are able to read and write. And then we take a look, I mean, again, I just feel so horrible because we're constantly taking a look at really that Central Africa, take a look at Afghanistan again. I will say, because I've been doing a lot of digging into education and literacy for you guys the last few weeks, is that we are seeing some improvement here. Where we're going to see problems with this is within gender divide. Why education? And so my students always want to default back to talking about education and looking at as an opportunity to learn about sex ed and to learn. The reality is when we talk education, education opens doors. It also prolongs, the longer you're in school, it prolongs or puts off having children at such a young age, which means you typically are not going to have as many children, which typically means we're not going to put the same pressures on our resources. And so there's just so many benefits to education besides just economic benefits that it's important for us to acknowledge that as well. Okay, so when we take a look at how we measure all this, we measure through something called the Human Development Index, HDI. And I am fascinated by this, partly because I think it gives us an opportunity for us to not just look at how much money you make or how much you have here. It really is about putting it all together. So we are going to look at money, but we're also going to talk about knowledge. Okay, and so notice here they're going to use expected years of schooling or means years of schooling, because ultimately we are seeing improvement in literacy rate, but it's how long are we going to school, because it's going to prolong some of those other things. It's going to open doors the longer I go to school, the type of schooling that I have. Life expectancy at birth is also an indicator. And so when we talk about how long am I going to live, that is going to talk about calories. That's going to talk about access to doctors. So we're going to look at that a little bit more. But the combination of these three things together gives us a rating. And we're going to look at that in just a second. Here's what I like to tell my students. Why your GNI is so important. And we're going to keep putting this in the back of your head. How else do we pay for the schooling? How else do we pay for the doctors? How else do we pay for those services that help us to move along that those levels of development? And so ultimately, I mean, nothing is for free. And so we need to be able to look at that money allows countries the ability to help others. So I mentioned this as discrepancies. And so when we talk about life expectancy, take a look here at life expectancy, men versus women. And so this is interesting when we look at everywhere around the world, we typically see that women do live longer than men. It's one of the few statistics where women rock throughout the world. Okay, and so some of it's genetics, some of it's going to be type of work that they're doing, some of it is there's other variables, but at the end of the day, we do still see some discrepancies. However, take a look at Africa in both graphs. Okay, we're still looking at lower life expectancy for both genders. Okay, and so part of this is going to be your access to healthcare. And so this is also how much money are we able to spend on healthcare? I mean, let's be honest, this is in the news like crazy right now, correct? We're talking about making sure we have enough resources, and we're in a country that's going to be on that higher end of the GNI and having that money. Think about these countries that don't have the expenditure, the money to spend on their health system. And so, I mean, you look at South Sudan, look at Pakistan, look at Indonesia. It makes it difficult if you don't have a healthy population. How can you then get the workforce moving at the rate that we need to get them moving? And so one of that too is investing in our doctors and nurses and midwives. And so this, you don't need to memorize these dailies along the left side, but really what that's looking at, and I apologize because I had to look it up too. So this is looking at the disability adjusted life years, but really what it's looking at here is the burden that not having enough doctors puts on a population. And when I look at those circles, okay, that's the total global health workforce of doctors and nurses. And so look at the Americas and Europe. When we talk Western Pacific, you're talking Japan, you're talking South Korea. And so that access to those services is going to give us an ability to live longer. Okay, so this big chart here. So when we look at all of these things together, this is when we come up with a Human Development Index rating or a value. And so why I point this chart out is not so that you memorize each one of these, but it's so that you can see how we calculate, but to see trends. And so when we look at the top 10 countries in the world, and so a perfect value would be a 1.0. So these are all over zero point 0.9. Take a look at the countries: Norway, Switzerland, Ireland, Germany. I'm going to skip a couple. Iceland, Sweden, Netherlands. Holy cow, what is Europe doing, right? And so there's some things we could learn from Europe. Um, Hong Kong, remember who ruled Hong Kong for 99 years. Okay, and so little shout out to some of our students that are in Hong Kong right now. I know one of my friends is a teacher over there. But take a look at Australia and Singapore. And so we're going to talk more about globalization and access and trade in these coming days. But ultimately, does that also open the door to more money so that we can invest it in our schools, so we can invest it in our healthcare? Take a look at the flip side. This is the bottom 10. What do you notice about all of these countries? Right? We struggle with the fact that most of them, I mean, look at this, under 0.5. Um, we struggle with the fact that how do we help these countries in Africa? Um, why is that? I mean, look at their GNI. Look at how low that is. How can they invest in these things? How can they invest in their schooling? How can they invest in, in their healthcare if they don't have money coming in? And so this is where we are going to talk about microfinancing later on. We're going to talk about other ways that maybe people can help because if you can't if you're not healthy and you're not educated, how can we then move into the workforce that's ultimately going to help us move up that ladder? On Friday, we're also going to take a look at gender a little more in depth. Because when we start looking at development and we start looking at life expectancy and schooling and GNI, you can't help but talk about the gaps and the divides. And so here, when we look at it, we look at here the green is where we rock: Northern Europe, Western Europe, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan. And so what we want to look at is, what are those countries getting right, but also where do these other countries have room for improvement? Because if we talk about half the population, how do we lift them up? So we're going to talk more about that on Friday. Hope you tune in. So let's see how we do. We've got some sets of data here again. So again, remember, nobody's going to ask you to memorize them. But when you see life expectancy, if I almost put my hand up to my computer so you couldn't see my numbers, but clearly that doesn't work because you're looking at my screen. But if you looked at just life expectancy, could you determine if they were an MDC or an LDC? How about years of schooling? I mean, let's be honest, that one's pretty drastic right now. I would hope you could with GNI. Infant mortality. I mean, look at those numbers. I mean, those numbers should make you sick to your stomach. If I was using 20 as our level last time, take a look at total fertility. And you should see then that translate into that urban percentage. So if you said that the first and third are LDCs, you're correct. In fact, Niger and Chad are some of the lowest ranking on the HDI scale. Poor Niger. In my students, when we look at data under our population unit, when we look at it here, they're like, Mrs. Brandt, they're just struggling. And so you really can see why. They just don't even have the money to invest into some of these things. Years of schooling, I mean, 2. It makes it really difficult to move forward if we're not talking about having an educated population. And then hopefully you were able to place MDCs on these other 2 countries or other 2 rows. When we take a look at the countries here, we've got Canada and Germany. Germany's kind of crushing it financially lately. And we still look at those percentages tend to be pretty in line with a lot of MDCs. So what do I really need us to see as far as trends? Really, when we look at those numbers, there are certain characteristics that we find throughout MDCs and LDCs. You see our Northern and Western Europe. You see North America. We see Australia. We see Japan and South Korea. There's bright spots, and hopefully your teachers have talked about the BRICS countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And we talk about how those are moving closer and becoming more developed. But it's that ability to invest back in their population that's going to allow them to do that. So we're nearing the end. So this I actually adjusted. This came from AP Classroom. So hopefully you guys have logged in there. But I liked this one because I think it's important for us to look at maps and charts and graphs. And so this one, I changed letter A. Letter A wanted you to identify some countries. And the reality is, based off of how we're doing things now, probably not going to have a lot of, it just wanted you to kind of, I forget exactly how it was having you identify, but it wasn't having you necessarily draw any conclusions. So here, I think this is a good question. Discuss potential limitations with regards to scale and data collection with this infant mortality rate map. Tomorrow, hopefully, Ms. Lindsley will talk about that with you, but really talking about how we gather that data and also the importance of scale. Describe an economic reason for the level of infant mortality rates in Western Europe, and also explain how infant mortality rates can be an indicator of gender equality. So equity, sorry. Hopefully, you can knock those out of the park based off of our conversation or our time spent today together. As always, if we're having problems with device or internet access, please don't hesitate to reach out or reach out on behalf of a friend. College Board is here to help you, so please take advantage of that. And I really want to thank you for watching. The sun is shining here today, so I'm super excited. And I hope you're able to join us tomorrow, and especially come back. I'm back on Friday. We're going to be talking about gender equity. Tomorrow, Miss Lindsay is going to be talking about how we're going to start looking at development from a different perspective. So hopefully you can join us. Have a great night, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Bye.